The rain had not stopped since morning, and Eleanor Vane had counted every minute of it from the narrow window of the servants' corridor, where she had been sent to wait like a parcel nobody wished to claim. She was not a servant. She only lived like one. 3 years had passed since her father died, owing more than his name could cover. And in that time Eleanor had learned the particular cruelty of being a poor relation in a rich house, welcomed at the table, forgotten in the room, dressed in her cousin's old gowns after they had gone out of fashion twice over. Tonight she wore grey, because grey did not draw the eye, and in Lady Marchmont's house, drawing the eye was a privilege reserved for one person only. That person was descending the staircase now, and the entire household seemed to exhale at the sight of her. Cassandra Vane was golden in candlelight the way some women simply were, without trying, without even the decency to look as though they had tried. Her hair caught every flame in the hall. Her laugh, when it came, made grown men forget what they had been saying. Eleanor had loved her cousin once, before she understood that love in that house was rationed, and Cassandra had been given the whole of it. "There you are," Cassandra said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "Mother wants you to see that the west parlour is ready. The guest arrives within the hour." "What guest?" "I don't know his name. Only that Mother has been strange about it for a week, and that Papa has locked himself in his study with the account books twice." Cassandra's eyes flicked over Eleanor's plain grey dress, with the mild, absent pity of someone glancing at a stray dog. "You look tired, Nora. You should rest more. It does nothing for a woman to look worn before she is even asked to marry." Asked to marry. As if such a thing were a question anyone intended to put to Eleanor Vane. She did not say what she thought. She had learned, in 3 years, exactly how much saying what she thought cost, and she had nothing left to spend. She went to the west parlour as she was told. She lit the last of the candles as she was told. And when her arms began to ache from carrying wood for a fire, meant to warm a stranger she would likely never be introduced to, she slipped out through the side door into the kitchen garden, simply to breathe air that did not belong to anyone else's plans. That was where she heard it. A crash, sharp and furious, coming from the direction of the old stable block, followed by a man's voice raised not in words but in something rawer than words, something that sounded like grief, wearing the mask of anger. Eleanor knew she should return to the house, a sensible woman, a careful woman, a woman with no standing and nothing to spare, would have turned back toward the light of the kitchen windows and pretended she had heard nothing at all. She went toward the sound instead. She found him in the tack room, where a lantern threw wild shadows against the walls, a saddle overturned at his feet, and his knuckles pressed white against the wooden rail, as though he meant to break it, or himself. He was not dressed as a gentleman of consequence. His coat was travel-stained, his cravat undone, his dark hair disordered as though he had dragged both hands through it more than once. He looked, in that half-light, like nothing more than a groom driven past his patience, or perhaps a young man of modest means who had ridden too far and too hard, and arrived with more temper than money. "You'll frighten the horses," Eleanor said, before she had decided to speak at all. He turned. For a moment his eyes held the wildness of a man interrupted mid-storm, and she thought he might snap at her the way such men often did. Instead, something in his face merely stopped, as if he had expected an insult and received instead a plain observation. "Then they may join the rest of the household in being frightened of me," he said, low and rough. "It seems to be the fashion tonight. It's a poor fashion. It never fit anyone well." She stepped further into the lantern light, unafraid in a way she could not entirely account for. "You've cut your hand." He looked down at his knuckles as though noticing them for the first time. Blood, thin and dark, traced along one finger. "It's nothing. It is something. It is blood, and blood is never nothing, whatever men like to say about it." She reached for the cloth hanging on the stall door, clean enough if not fine, and held it out. When he did not take it, she took his hand herself, turning it toward the light, and pressed the cloth against the cut with a firmness that startled them both. "You needn't trouble yourself," he said, though he did not pull away. "I'm not troubling myself. I'm simply not able to stand by and watch a man bleed onto good straw when a cloth would answer." She glanced up at him properly then, and found him watching her with an expression she could not read. Not the polite blankness of men who did not see her, nor the mild pity of men who saw her only enough to dismiss her. He was looking at her the way one looks at a locked door behind which something unexpected has begun to speak. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not quite a question. Should I be? Most people find it prudent. His mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "I have been told tonight, by no fewer than 3 persons, that I have my father's temper and none of his patience for hiding it. Then perhaps you ought to stop breaking things, and start saying whatever it is you are so plainly trying not to say." Eleanor tied the cloth off with a neat, economical knot, the kind she had learned tending her father through his final illness, when no maid could be afforded, and love had to do the work of skill. It generally goes better for the furniture. That won something from him, not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one, exhaled rather than spoken. "You are remarkably unimpressed with me. I don't know you well enough to be impressed or otherwise. I only know that a man weeping into a saddle at 8:30 in the evening is a man who has had a very bad day, and bad days deserve tea more than temper. I was not weeping." "No," she agreed gently. "Of course not." He studied her a moment longer, and something in his shoulders, some rigid, defended thing, eased by a fraction. "What is your name?" She hesitated. It was such a small question, and yet in that house her name was a small and shameful thing, worn thin from disuse. "Eleanor," she said finally. "Eleanor Vane." "Vane?" He repeated it as though testing its weight. And for half a heartbeat something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, or the shadow of it, before he seemed to set it deliberately aside. "I am called Ashworth." It was, though she did not know it then, entirely true, and entirely a door left carefully ajar rather than opened. She took it for a surname offered the way modest men offered them, without title, without ceremony, and she thought. Foolishly, sweetly, in the private chamber of her own heart, here at last is someone who does not know what I am not. "Well, Mr. Ashworth," she said, "I should return before I'm missed, though I don't imagine I will be. You should have that hand looked at properly. And you should stop striking saddles. They've done nothing to deserve it." She was 3 steps toward the door when his voice stopped her. "Miss Vane." She turned. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in the plainness of it, the lack of practiced charm, that struck her far harder than any compliment Cassandra's suitors ever paid in the drawing-room. "I did not expect kindness tonight. Kindness is cheap," she said. "I can afford it, even when I can afford little else." She left him standing among the overturned tack with his bandaged hand and his unreadable eyes, and did not look back to see how long he watched the door after she had gone. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was the rain, drumming against the thin glass of her small room at the top of the house, the room that had once been meant for a lady's maid, before economy dictated that Eleanor should occupy it instead, and save the family the expense of a proper chamber. She lay listening to the water and turning the stranger's words over in her mind, unable to account for why a single evening's kindness to a man whose name she barely knew should feel more substantial than 3 years of careful, dutiful silence in that house. In the morning she scolded herself for it. A stranger with a wounded hand and an unhappy temper was no foundation for the kind of foolish hope she had spent 3 years training herself out of feeling, and she resolved, over a breakfast she took alone in the small parlour, while the family breakfasted properly above, to think of him no further. She managed almost a full day before Cassandra mentioned, over needlework in the drawing room, that a strange gentleman had been seen the previous evening riding hard up the drive in the rain, dismounting before the stable boy could reach him, and stalking off toward the outbuildings alone. Mother says he arrived a full day early, and in a temper, Cassandra said, threading her needle without looking up. One of the grooms says he broke a bridle clean in half. Can you imagine the nerve of it, breaking Pepper's tack before he's even been introduced properly? Eleanor kept her eyes on her own stitching and said nothing, though her fingers had gone very still. She did not learn his name in full until the following afternoon, when the household was summoned to the drawing room to receive its guest properly, and Eleanor, hovering as always at the edge of rooms rather than their centre, watched her aunt sweep forward with a smile so wide it looked painful. "Your Grace," Lady Marchmont said, sinking into a curtsy so deep it nearly folded her in half, "you do us the greatest honour." Eleanor's breath left her slowly, as though the air itself had thinned. The man who entered was not the young stranger from the tack room. He was older, silver-templed, with a bearing that filled the room the way weather fills a valley, not loudly, but completely. This, she understood in the space of a single-held breath, was the Duke of Sherborne, whose name she had heard whispered in that house for a week, with the particular reverence reserved for men who could alter the whole shape of a family's fortune with a single signature. And a step behind him, dressed now in dark, immaculate blue, his hair combed into order, his bandaged hand hidden beneath a glove, stood the young master from the stable. Their eyes met across the room. She watched, with a cold drop of understanding settling through her chest like a stone through still water, as something passed over his face, not surprise, for he had known, but a kind of bracing, as though he had known this moment was coming, and had hoped foolishly to delay it a little longer. "My son," the Duke said, with the easy pride of a man introducing his greatest asset, "Julian Ashworth, Marquess of Rowan." The room curtsied and bowed as one. Eleanor's body performed the motion out of habit, though her mind had gone very far away, replaying every word she had said to him the night before. "You needn't trouble yourself. I don't know you well enough to be impressed. Kindness is cheap, and I can afford it. And hearing, beneath each one." The terrible new echo of "he let me believe he was nothing, and I was fool enough to believe it gladly." She did not look at him again for the rest of the visit. She did not have to. She could feel him watching her the way one feels a storm gathering before the first drop of rain. Not yet arrived, but certain. Dinner that evening was a trial of a particular kind she had not before endured. She was seated, as always, at the lesser end of the table, well below the salt, and well below the notice of anyone who mattered, and yet she was acutely, unbearably aware of the Marquess of Rowan, seated near his father, at the head of it, answering questions about his travels with the smooth, practiced ease of a man long accustomed to being observed, while never once, that she could see, allowing his gaze to drift toward her end of the table. She told herself this was proof enough of what she already suspected, that the tack room had been an aberration, a moment stolen from a man's private unhappiness, and that the Marquess of Rowan, restored now to his proper rank and his proper manners, had no further use for the plain cousin who had bound his hand and spoken to him as though he were nobody at all. It was, she thought, exactly what she deserved for having hoped even a little. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong until later that night, when a note arrived at her door by the hand of a housemaid too well trained to ask questions, folded small and sealed with nothing more identifying than a plain wax circle. "I did not look at you at dinner because I did not trust myself to look only once," it read, in a hand as forceful and unpolished as the man himself. "You once told me that bad days deserve tea more than temper. I find myself, tonight, in want of both, and in want of company that does not measure its words for what they might gain from mine. If you are willing, the library keeps a fire lit past midnight, and no one troubles to visit it. J.A. Eleanor read it 3 times before she allowed herself to admit that she meant to go. The library, when she reached it, was empty of everyone but him, and the fire he had promised burned low and steady in the old stone hearth. He rose the moment she entered, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, as though both were unsure which version of the previous night's honesty still belonged to them, now that rank and title stood so plainly between them. "I did not tell you who I was," he said at last, "because for one evening I did not wish to be the Marquess of Rowan to anyone. I wished only to be a man whose hand needed binding, and who was fortunate enough to have it bound by someone who did not first ask what such a kindness might be worth to her." "And now?" Eleanor asked, though her voice was not quite steady. "Now that I know precisely what it might be worth. Now I find I would rather you knew everything and stayed than knew nothing, and left believing I had wanted a stranger more than I want you." He did not move toward her, though she sensed, in the careful stillness of him, exactly how much restraint that cost. "I am not asking anything of you tonight, Miss Vane. I am only asking that you not decide, before you know the whole of me, that the man in the stable was more honest than the man standing before you now." She thought of Cassandra's easy laughter at dinner, of her own grey dress and lesser seat, of 3 years spent believing that whatever warmth passed her way was borrowed rather than owed. It would have been simpler in many ways to retreat behind her old caution and leave the library exactly as she had entered it. Unmoved, unclaimed, unbothered by hope she could not afford to lose twice. She did not retreat. "I have not decided anything," she said instead, "except that I find I would rather know the whole of you than none of it, whatever the knowing costs me." It was not quite a declaration, from either of them, but it was enough that night to sit together by a dying fire and speak of his mother, dead these 6 years, whose loss had left her son with a temper he had never quite learned to master, and a father who mistook silence for strength, of Eleanor's own father, and the particular ache of losing a parent who had loved her without condition in a house now full of people who loved her only conditionally, if at all. By the time she rose to return to her room, the fire had burned to embers, and something unspoken and fragile had taken root between them that neither was yet prepared to name. The Duke's business, it transpired over the following days, concerned Eleanor directly, though it took the better part of a week before anyone thought to tell her so plainly, and even then it came not from her aunt, but from an overheard fragment of conversation, through a half-closed study door, which was, she had come to learn, the only reliable source of truth in that house. "An old debt," the Duke was saying, his voice low but carrying, "and I do not intend to leave it unsettled while I have breath left to settle it. Edmund Vane pulled me from beneath my own overturned carriage on the Bath Road 20 years ago, at the cost of his own arm's use for a full season. He would take nothing for it, not money, not land, not favour. He said only that if ever I could do something for his daughter, I should do it, and he trusted me to know when the moment came." A pause, heavy with old grief. "He is dead now. His daughter is unmarried, unprovided for, and living on the charity of relations who, forgive me my bluntness, Lady Marchmont, do not appear inclined to be generous with it. I intend to see her settled. Well settled. I have a candidate in mind." Eleanor's hand had gone to the doorframe, cold fingers against colder wood. "A candidate? Your Grace?" Lady Marchmont's voice had climbed an eager half-octave. "My son," the Duke said simply. "He does not yet know the particulars of the debt, only that I wish him to make her acquaintance properly, and form his own judgment, as any man of sense should be permitted to do before marriage rather than after. I will not command his heart. I will only put the two of them in a room together, and trust that a man raised with any decency will recognize worth when he sees it, whatever gown it happens to be wearing. Eleanor stepped back from the door as though it had scalded her. She thinks he does not know the particulars, but he did know one particular the Duke had not accounted for, that he had already met her, already spoken with her, already let her wrap his bleeding hand and speak to him as though he were an ordinary man with ordinary troubles, and had said nothing. She did not know, standing there in the dim corridor, with her heart beating too hard for the news to fit inside it, whether to feel grateful or betrayed. She only knew, with a certainty that settled cold and final in her chest, that whatever tenderness had passed between them in the tack-room had not been what she believed it to be. It had been, perhaps, a test, or a game, or worse, a kindness performed by a man who already knew precisely what she was worth to his father's plans, and had simply enjoyed, for one evening, playing at being someone she might have chosen freely. She avoided him for 3 days, which was not difficult in a house so large that entire wings went unused. But on the 4th evening he found her in the library, where she had gone to escape a dinner she had not been invited to attend, and where the last of the daylight fell gold and slanting across shelves nobody else in that house ever troubled to open. "You've been avoiding me," he said from the doorway, and she did not need to turn to know it was him. She had already learned, without meaning to, the particular quality of his voice. "I did not think there was anything left to say to a man who lied to me the first night I met him." I did not lie. He came further into the room, and she heard the careful, deliberate slowness of his steps, as though he were approaching something that might startle and run. "I told you my name was Ashworth. It is my name. I only did not tell you the rest of it. That is the same as lying, when the rest of it is the only part that matters to everyone else in this house. It is not the part that mattered to me." His voice, when it came, had lost its usual composure. There was something almost raw beneath it, the same rawness she had heard the night she found him among the broken tack. "For one evening, Miss Vane, no one looked at me and saw a dukedom. No one measured their words for what they might gain from them. You told me to stop breaking saddles. You called kindness cheap and gave it to me anyway, though you had no reason to think I could ever repay it. Do you have any notion how rare that is for a man in my position? I did not correct you because I did not want it to end." Eleanor turned from the window at last and found him closer than she had expected, his expression stripped of the polished ease he had worn in the drawing-room, left with only the same unguarded weariness she had seen by lantern light. "Your father means to arrange a marriage for me," she said, because there seemed no purpose left in pretending otherwise. "I heard him say it through his study door. He believes he owes a debt to my late father, and he intends to pay it by settling me on you, as though I were an account to be balanced, rather than a woman with a will of my own." Something crossed his face then, not surprise, but a kind of grim, unhappy recognition. "I did not know the particulars until this morning. I knew only that he wished me to make your acquaintance and judge for myself. I did not know it was a debt of blood he meant to repay with my hand in marriage." He exhaled, and for a moment looked younger than she had ever seen him, and considerably less certain. "I understand if that knowledge changes everything you felt in that stable. I understand if you cannot now believe that anything I said to you was free of it." "Was it?" she asked, and hated how much she needed the answer to be yes. "I did not know your name meant anything to my father's ledgers when I told you mine meant something to no one," he said. "By the time I learned otherwise, I found I did not regret a single word I had spoken to you. I find, Miss Vane, that I regret nothing except the days I have spent since, watching you walk past me in corridors as though we were strangers, when I know very well we are not." She wanted, fiercely, to believe him. That wanting frightened her more than his rank ever could. "Your father will marry us to settle his conscience," she said. "Not because either of us was ever truly asked." "Then let us ask each other," he said quietly, "and see if the answer differs from his." She did not answer him that evening, could not, with her heart in such disarray, and her pride still smarting from the wound of having been, however gently, deceived. But she did not leave the library either, and for an hour they sat with the fading light between them, speaking of nothing that mattered and everything that did, and when she finally rose to go he did not try to stop her, only watched her leave with an expression she carried with her, long after the door had closed. If Eleanor had hoped that the matter might resolve itself quietly, in the private language of two people learning to trust each other again, she had not accounted for Cassandra. Her cousin had watched the Duke's visit with the sharp, assessing eye of a woman who understood precisely what a Marquess's attention was worth, and it had not taken her long to notice that his attention, however carefully rationed in public, tended most often toward the plain cousin in grey, rather than the golden one everyone expected him to prefer. "You cannot seriously imagine," Cassandra said one morning, catching Eleanor alone in the corridor outside the breakfast room, her voice pitched low and pleasant in the way that meant real cruelty was coming, "that Lord Rowan intends anything by his politeness to you beyond ordinary manners. Men of his rank are taught to be gracious to everyone, Nora, the scullery maid included. It costs them nothing." "I imagine nothing," Eleanor said, though her chest tightened. "I have made no claim on his lordship's attention." "Good, because I mean to have it, and I would rather not have to be unkind about how I get it." Cassandra's smile did not waver. "You've had a strange sort of dream this past week, haven't you? A duke's son, taking an interest in you? It's rather sweet in its way. Girls like you need something to hope for. But hope is not the same as being chosen, and I promise you, when the choosing is done, it will not be you standing at the altar." Eleanor said nothing. There was, she had learned long ago, no version of an answer that would satisfy Cassandra, and so she saved her breath for the things that mattered. A fresh trouble arrived before that quiet trial had fully passed, in the form of a letter that went missing from the Duke's own study. A letter, it was later discovered, containing the written record of Sir Edmund Vane's old promise. The single piece of proof that the debt the Duke spoke of had ever truly existed. Without it, certain of the Duke's more distant relations, a cousin of his late wife's, one Lord Pemberton, who stood to inherit a portion of the Sherborne fortune should the Marquis remain unwed past his 30th year, and who had watched the courtship unfold with an interest far less generous than it appeared, began to whisper that the whole arrangement was nothing more than a fiction, a convenient tale invented to dress up an unequal match in the borrowed dignity of honour repaid. "They will say I invented my father's courage to secure myself a title," Eleanor said to Julian, white-faced. The evening the letter's disappearance became known through the house. "They will say I am nothing but an ambitious girl with a clever story, and no proof left to answer them." "They may say what they like," Julian answered, though his jaw was tight with an anger she recognized now not as temper, but as protectiveness. "But they will not say it twice in my hearing, and they will not say it at all once I have found the man responsible." He did find him, within 3 days, through the quiet, dogged persistence of a groom who recalled seeing Lord Pemberton loitering near the study on the very afternoon the letter vanished, and a chambermaid who had, out of simple loyalty to a duke, who had always treated his servants with more courtesy than his rank required, noticed a folded paper tucked hastily into a guest's coat pocket, and thought little of it until asked directly. Confronted quietly, without the theatre of public accusation, Lord Pemberton surrendered the letter within the hour, protesting all the while that he had meant only to delay matters, not destroy them, though no one in the room believed the distinction mattered much to the harm he had nearly done. The Duke, when the letter was restored to him, said nothing to his wife's cousin beyond a single cold sentence, that he would not see the man again under any roof of his, and turned instead to Eleanor with an apology so plain and so heartfelt that she found herself, for the first time since her father's death, comforted rather than diminished by a powerful man's attention. "I should have kept it somewhere safer," the Duke said. "I did not think anyone in my own house capable of such pettiness. I am sorry it was your name put at risk to teach me otherwise." It was, Eleanor thought afterward, a small crisis compared to what might have come of it, but it had taught her something she had not expected to learn from a stolen letter, that the family she was marrying into, whatever its grandeur, was not so very different from her own in its capacity for jealousy and scheming, and that what mattered, in the end, was not the absence of such trouble, but the presence of people willing to stand against it on her behalf. There was, too, a harder trial than Cassandra's schemes, one that came from within Eleanor's own proud, wounded heart rather than from anyone else's design. It arrived on a grey afternoon when her aunt, flushed with sudden warmth now that a duke's interest had made her niece worth cultivating, let slip over tea that the marriage, should it come to pass, would settle certain family debts of the Marchmont's own, a mortgage on the North Farm, quietly held, that the Duke had offered to forgive as a mark of goodwill toward the match. Eleanor set down her cup very carefully, so that it would not betray the trembling of her hand. "You mean to say," she said, "that my aunt and uncle stand to profit from my marriage as well?" "Everyone stands to profit from a good marriage, Nora. That is rather the point of them," her aunt said, oblivious to the wound she had just opened. "You mustn't be missish about it." But Eleanor was, for the rest of that day and the two that followed, entirely missish about it, in the private, silent way she had perfected over 3 years of swallowing her own feelings whole. She could bear being married for her father's old debt of honor. She found she could not so easily bear the thought that her own family had folded her happiness into their ledgers alongside a mortgaged farm, weighing her heart in the same scales as an unpaid loan, and she began, with the particular stubbornness of the truly wounded, to hold Julian at a careful distance, answering his notes with brevity, finding reasons to be elsewhere when he sought her out, until even his patient warmth began to cool into confusion, and then into a wary, wounded silence of his own. "Have I done something?" he asked her at last, catching her alone in the passage outside the morning room, his voice low and uncertain in a way she had not heard since the tack room. "You have done nothing," she said, which was true, and which was also, she realized even as she said it, entirely the wrong thing to say to a man who deserved better than her silence. "It is not you I am guarding myself against, Julian. It is the shape of everything around us, my aunt's debts, your father's promise, a whole house full of people who see in our marriage nothing but what it might settle for them. I begin to wonder if there is any room left in it for what we might feel, once every ledger has been balanced." "Then let us stop balancing ledgers," he said, "and simply ask each other plainly, without an audience of debts and duties standing between us, what it is we actually want." He did not press further than that day, but something in the steadiness of his asking loosened, by degrees, the cold and frightened place in her that had begun to close itself off against hope, and though the distance between them did not vanish all at once, it began, slowly, to narrow again. But Cassandra was not a woman content to leave matters to chance. Within a fortnight she had engineered a picnic by the river, arranged with the deliberate precision of a general planning a campaign, at which she contrived to be seated beside Julian at every turn, to laugh at his every remark, to appear, to any observer, the natural and inevitable choice. Eleanor watched from a polite distance, pouring tea no one wanted, and told herself firmly that she did not care. She cared a great deal. It was only when Cassandra, in a moment of theatrical distress, pretended to twist her ankle on the riverbank and required Julian's arm to walk her back to the house, an arm he gave, because he was too well bred to refuse a lady in apparent pain, whatever he privately suspected of its sincerity. That Eleanor understood how thoroughly the ground beneath her had been arranged without her consent. She excused herself before the party returned to the house and did not attend dinner that evening, pleading a headache that was not entirely a lie. Julian came to find her again, as she had known, in some private and reluctant part of herself, that he would. "You left before I could speak to you," he said, finding her in the orangery among the pale winter roses her aunt grew for cutting and never cut. "I had nothing to say that would not have sounded like jealousy, and I did not care to give your cousin, my cousin, the satisfaction of hearing it. There is nothing between myself and Miss Cassandra Vane," he said, with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact rather than defending himself. "There has never been. I have eyes, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs, "and I have used them, this past fortnight, for very little else but watching you pretend not to watch me." "I have not. You have," he said gently, "as I have watched you. I am not a fool, whatever my temper suggests, and I am not so easily managed by a twisted ankle as your cousin appears to believe." She looked away, toward the roses, because it was easier than looking at him. "Your father wants this match for reasons of debt and duty. Your family wants it, if they want it at all, for reasons of alliance. And my cousin wants the opposite of it, simply because she has never in her life wanted anything less than everything. Nowhere in any of that is there room for what I might want, or what you might, if either of us were ever truly free to choose." "Then let us make room," Julian said, and there was something fierce beneath the quiet of it. "I do not intend to marry you because my father owes a debt. Eleanor, if I marry you, when I marry you, if you will permit me the hope of it, it will be because I have not been able, since the night you tied a cloth around my hand and told me kindness was cheap, to imagine marrying anyone else. It was, she would think later, the nearest thing to a declaration he had yet allowed himself, and she was not ready, not yet, to trust it fully. But she let herself for one unguarded moment among the pale roses believe that it might be true. The reckoning, when it came publicly, as such things in that world so often did, at a ball held in the great hall of Sherborne House itself, to which the Marchmont family had been invited with a promptness that made plain the Duke's intentions had become, in society's eyes, an open secret. Eleanor had never worn a gown so fine. It had been, in fact, a kindness so unexpected it had nearly undone her composure entirely. A length of deep blue silk arriving 3 days before the ball, with no card attached, though the modist who came to fit it let slip, in an unguarded moment, that his lordship had chosen the colour himself, remarking that grey had never suited a woman with such warmth in her face. Cassandra's gown that evening was gold, and magnificent, and drew every eye in the room the moment she entered it. Every eye, Eleanor noted with a small, private ache of vindication she was not proud of, except the one pair that mattered. Julian crossed the ballroom floor to her before she had even finished her curtsy to the receiving line, in full view of 200 guests of his father, of Lady Marchmont's stricken and rapidly recalculating expression, and of Cassandra's frozen smile. "Miss Vane," he said, loudly enough to carry, offering his arm with a formality that somehow managed to feel, beneath its correctness, entirely like a claim. "Will you do me the honour of the first dance?" The room's murmur rose around them like water finding a crack in a dam. Eleanor felt every eye in the hall settle on her plain, unremarkable face, and for one terrible moment the old instinct, to shrink, to demur, to make herself small enough that the attention might pass over her, and land somewhere it was more accustomed to resting, rose up in her chest like a tide. She set it down. She had spent 3 years making herself small in that house, and it had won her nothing but invisibility. "I will, my lord," she said, and took his arm. If the dance itself was a small triumph, What followed it was a far crueler test. Cassandra, watching her plans unravel in front of the very society she had meant to impress, did not retreat gracefully. Within the hour, a whisper had begun to move through the ballroom, carried, Eleanor would later learn, from Cassandra's own careful seeding, that Miss Vane had contrived the entire courtship from the start, that she had known Lord Rowan's identity in the stable that first night, and pursued him deliberately, that a penniless girl with nothing to recommend her had set a calculated trap for a marquis, and was now, disgracefully, springing it in full view of his own father's house. Eleanor heard the whisper reach her before she saw its source, in the sudden coolness of a matron's glance, the abrupt silence of a cluster of young ladies as she passed. She understood, with the sick, familiar dread of a woman who had spent her whole life being judged and found wanting, exactly what was happening, and exactly how little power she had to stop it. She retreated for a moment to the edge of the terrace doors, where the cool night air offered some small relief from the heat of 200 candles and 200 pairs of watching eyes. It was there that Cassandra found her, having abandoned the pretense of sympathy entirely now that her scheme had begun, at last, to take hold. "You ought to have stayed in your grey dresses, Nora," Cassandra said, quietly, so that only Eleanor could hear. "You were safer there. No one troubles to destroy a woman no one has noticed. But you would insist on being noticed, and now you shall see what it costs." "I did not ask to be noticed," Eleanor said. "I asked only to be permitted the same honesty everyone else in that room is permitted, and denied to me alone." Honesty. Cassandra's laugh was brittle, unlike her usual easy warmth. "You have always been so certain of your own goodness, haven't you, the poor, patient cousin, too dignified to complain, too proud to scheme. I wonder if you have ever once considered that some of us were not given the luxury of being loved for nothing. I have spent my whole life being told my worth was my face and my fortune, and you have spent yours believing your worth was your suffering. Perhaps neither of us has been as honest as we like to think. It was, Eleanor would realize only much later, the nearest thing to a true confession Cassandra had ever offered her, buried inside an insult. And in that moment, she felt something unexpected loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first thin thread of understanding for a cousin she had, spent 3 years resenting, without ever once wondering what her own cage might have looked like from the inside. She did not have the chance to answer. The whisper had by then travelled the length of the ballroom, gathering weight as it went, until it reached the ears of an elderly baroness bold enough to repeat it, quite loudly, within earshot of the Duke himself. It was the Duke who stopped it. He had been watching, she realized later far more closely than she had known, watching his son's face across the ballroom, watching hers, watching the gathering storm of gossip with the patient attention of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read a room before it turned against him. He crossed to where she stood, alone for a moment near the edge of the dance floor, her chin lifted with a dignity that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know, and offered her his arm, as though she were the only woman present worth escorting. "Miss Vane," he said, his voice pitched to carry, as his son's had been, "I find I owe you an apology that is long overdue, and I mean to make it publicly, since it was publicly that the debt of your father's courage was so nearly forgotten." He turned deliberately to address the room at large, and the ballroom's chatter died beneath the weight of a duke's attention, the way it never had for a whisper. 20 years ago, Sir Edmund Vane pulled me from beneath an overturned carriage at the cost of the use of his own arm, and asked nothing for it beyond my word that I would look after his daughter's future, should the need ever arise. That need has arisen. I have watched Miss Vane these past weeks, with the eyes of a man determining whether a debt of honor might also, by good fortune, become a match of the heart, and I have found nothing in her but courage, honesty, and a dignity this room would do well to imitate rather than malign. His gaze swept, briefly and unmistakably, toward Cassandra, who had gone quite pale. "I would remind this company that gossip is cheap, and character is not, and I have yet to see the former outlast the latter in any house I have ever governed." The silence that followed was absolute, and then, as such silences in ballrooms so often did, dissolved into a rustle of recalculated opinion, of matrons suddenly recalling how very well Miss Vane had always seemed to carry herself, of young ladies suddenly eager to claim a prior acquaintance. Eleanor did not care for their recalculation. She cared only for the warmth of Julian's hand finding hers a moment later, steady and sure, in front of everyone who had, an hour before, been prepared to condemn her. "I told you," he said quietly, for her ears alone, "that I did not intend to let anyone else write the ending to this." The weeks that followed were not without their difficulties. Lady Marchmont's sudden transparent warmth toward her niece was its own small trial, and Cassandra's cold civility took longer than either of them expected to soften into something like genuine, if reluctant, respect. But the worst of the storm had broken, and what remained afterward was clearer weather than Eleanor had known in the whole of her adult life. It was Cassandra herself, in fact, who came to Eleanor's room some 10 days after the ball, uninvited and uncharacteristically hesitant, her golden composure for once entirely absent. "I have not come to apologize prettily," she said, standing just inside the door as though unsure of her welcome, "because I do not think I know how. And I have never been taught to value honesty the way you seem to. But I find I cannot go on pretending I did not try to ruin you, and I find, more surprisingly still, that I am ashamed of it." Eleanor set down her needlework and studied her cousin properly, perhaps for the first time in years, not as the golden rival who had claimed every room she entered, but as a young woman who had, in her own way, been shaped just as ruthlessly by that house's arithmetic of worth. "Why did you do it?" she asked, not unkindly. "Because I watched a man look at you the way no man has ever looked at me," Cassandra said, and her voice, for once, held nothing performed in it at all, "and I did not know how to bear it except to try to take it from you before I had to admit I envied it. I have spent my whole life being told I was fortunate, Nora, and I have never once been asked whether I wished to be chosen for my face or for myself. I do not think anyone has ever wondered which it was. I am not certain I have ever wondered it either." There was little Eleanor could offer that would undo 3 years of quiet rivalry between them. But she found, unexpectedly, that she no longer wished to. "Then let us both wonder it from here on," she said, "and perhaps neither of us need spend the rest of our lives measuring ourselves against the other to find an answer. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning, and in a house that had taught them both so little of generosity, a beginning was no small thing." The Duke, for his part, sought Eleanor out privately in the days that followed, in the same quiet, deliberate manner with which he seemed to do everything of consequence. He found her in the orangery, among the pale roses that had by then become, in her own private mind, inseparable from the whole strange unravelling of her fortune. "I owe you a fuller account than I gave the ballroom," he said, settling himself with the careful stiffness of a man whose bones had begun to feel the weight of his years. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, and the most stubborn. I offered him money enough to buy back every acre his family had ever lost, and he refused every shilling of it, laughing at me the whole while, and told me instead that a man ought to be careful what he asks of fortune, since fortune has a long memory and an inconvenient sense of timing. I did not understand him fully until I watched my own son fall in love with his daughter entirely by accident, in a stable, before either of them knew whose debt they were about to settle. His eyes, when they met hers, held none of the ducal formality he wore in company, only a plain and weathered warmth. I do not offer you my son to close an old account, Eleanor. I offer him to you because I have watched him become, in your company, more like the boy his mother raised, and less like the bitter young man grief had begun to make of him. And I find I owe your father a truer debt than gold could ever settle. The debt of having given the world a daughter capable of that particular grace. Eleanor did not trust her voice enough to answer him properly, and so she said only, simply, "Thank you, your grace," and let the roses and the silence say the rest. Julian came to her one final time in the library, where they had first spoken honestly to one another, on an evening when the last of the autumn light lay gold across the same shelves, and did not offer his arm this time, but knelt instead, with none of the practiced elegance she imagined other men of his rank might have brought to the moment, and all of the plain, unguarded sincerity she had first glimpsed by lantern light in a stable full of broken tack. "I have loved you," he said, "since before I knew what my father intended, and I will go on loving you long after every debt between our families is settled and forgotten. I am not asking you to marry a duke's son, Eleanor. I am asking you to marry the man who broke a saddle in his grief and found, in you, the first honest kindness anyone had offered him in years. Will you have me, not for your father's courage, and not for mine, but simply because I am asking, and I have never wanted anything so much in my life?" Eleanor thought of 3 years of grey dresses and unclaimed corners, of a name spoken so rarely in that house it had nearly become a stranger to her own ears, of a night in a stable when she had chosen, for no reason but her own nature, to walk toward a sound of anger instead of away from it. "Yes," she said, and found that the word, so long withheld from her by circumstance, came easily now that it was finally, truly hers to give. "Yes, Julian, I will." He rose and kissed her then, gently, as though she was something he had waited a long while to be permitted to hold, and outside the library windows the last of the daylight gave way to a clear autumn evening, the kind that promised, after a long season of rain, nothing but fair weather ahead. They were married the following spring, in the small chapel at Sherborne, with pale roses cut at last from the orangery, and woven through Eleanor's dark hair. The morning of the wedding dawned clear after a week of uncertain weather, and Eleanor stood at the window of the room that had been given to her at Sherborne House, a proper room now, high-ceilinged and sun-filled, nothing at all like the narrow chamber under the eaves, where she had once lain awake listening to rain and telling herself not to hope, and found she could hardly recognize. In the woman reflected back at her, the girl who had once measured her worth by how little space she was permitted to take up in a room. Cassandra came to help her dress that morning, an office she had asked for herself rather than had assigned to her, and pinned the last of the roses into Eleanor's hair with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I used to think," she said, working in silence for a while before she spoke, "that there was only room in any house for one woman to be loved properly, and that I had best make certain it was always myself. I do not think that any longer. I am glad, Nora, truly, that it was you. I do not know that I have ever said anything to you that I meant quite so plainly." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did. If any guest at the ceremony that day still remembered the whispers of the ballroom, none were foolish enough to speak them aloud in the hearing of the Duke, who stood throughout the service with the quiet, satisfied bearing of a man who had finally, after 20 years, settled a debt of honor in the only currency that had ever truly mattered. He wept, discreetly and without apology, when his son took Eleanor's hand before the altar, and later confessed to her, over the wedding breakfast, that he had not expected, at his age, to feel a stranger's daughter become as dear to him as his own son's happiness. Julian, for his part, said little during the ceremony beyond the vows themselves, but Eleanor had learned by then that his stillness, far from the coldness the rest of society so often mistook it for, was simply the particular quiet of a man who felt too much to trust himself with easy words. It was only afterward, as the carriage carried them from the chapel through lanes bright with early blossom, that he finally spoke what had clearly been sitting in him all through the long, formal hours of the day. "I have thought a great deal," he said, taking her hand in both of his, "about what my life would have become had you turned back toward the house that first night, instead of walking toward the noise in the stable. I do not think I would have broken any fewer saddles. I do not think I would have become any less my father's disappointment, nor any less a stranger to my own better nature. You did not know, that night, that you were doing anything more than tying a cloth around a stranger's hand. I have never been able to make you understand, I think, that you were doing a great deal more than that." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the countryside rolled bright and green past the carriage window, "you might spend the rest of our lives together trying to make me understand it properly, since one afternoon was plainly not enough." "I intend to," he said, "for as many years as you will permit me the privilege." Eleanor Vane, who had spent so long believing herself the overlooked cousin in another woman's borrowed light, left that chapel a marchioness and, more precious to her by far than any title, a woman finally, fully seen, not for what she could repay, nor for what she had been denied, but simply, at long last, for who she had always quietly, stubbornly been, even in the years when no one else in that house had thought to look. And when Julian looked at her across the carriage that carried them from the chapel toward the beginning of their life together, there was no trace left in his face of the angry young man who had once broken saddles in the dark. There was only the steady, unguarded warmth of a man who had been comforted once by a stranger who owed him nothing, and who had spent every day since determined to spend the whole of his life proving himself worthy of that first unclaimed kindness. It had cost her nothing to be kind to him that first night. She would think often in the years that followed, whenever she passed the old stable block on her way through the gardens, and remembered, with a private contented smile, the sound of breaking tack that had once seemed like the worst of omens and had turned out, in the end, to be the beginning of everything she had ever quietly hoped her life might become. She had asked for nothing that night, but a moment's honesty in a house that had taught her to expect none. She had been given, in return, a love that asked to be earned rather than owed, and a family, at last, that chose her not out of duty or debt, but simply, plainly because she was Eleanor, and that, she had learned, had always been enough, and always would be for as long as she lived, in that house or in any other she might ever call her own.